Welcome to Nothing Ventured with me, Aarish Shah. This is the podcast where we explore the people and stories that make up the tech and venture ecosystem. Don't forget to subscribe, like, rate, and share the podcast because it really helps us get the word out to more people who are curious about understanding even more about the world of venture capital. This season of Nothing Ventured is sponsored by Odin. Odin helps angels, VCs, and founders to raise and deploy capital seamlessly. You can structure your SPVs and now run your funds, handle capital calls, portfolio management more smoothly and easily in one place. Founders use Odin to raise their entire round in a few clicks by simply sending investors a link and receiving investments immediately. Odin works with over 5,000 investors and over 150 emerging fund managers and angel syndicates globally. Head to joinodin.com to learn more. That's joinodin.com. Hello and welcome to another episode of Nothing Ventured with me, Aarish Shah. Today, I was really excited to have with me in the studio Adam Liska. Adam is co-founder and CEO of Glyphic, an AI co-pilot that helps your sales team sell more with task automation and personalized pre-meeting briefs. Prior to founding Glyphic, Adam was a research scientist at Spotify, later moving to DeepMind, where the first project he got involved in was protein folding. Over the course of his time at DeepMind, he got more and more excited about the potential for diverse applications of large language models, LLMs, and decided to co-found Glyphic, knowing that he could move faster if he built it outside of Google. In today's episode, we talked about how to scale those models, how language is the universal interface to everything, is remixing data the same as intelligence, augmentation versus autonomy within AI, Mustafa, Suleyman, and the new Turing test, and taking the human out of the loop and letting AI act in the world. Let's get straight into it. Adam, it's absolutely great to have you in the studio with me. I can't wait to get into some of these topics. As someone that's very kind of geeky around tech, but not necessarily techie themselves, it's really interesting for me to speak to someone who's so heavily entrenched in specific ecosystem. And obviously for you, that's very much around artificial intelligence, machine learning, etc. So, you are very deeply entrenched in the field of AI, and you have a bachelor's degree in computer science, an MSc in cognitive science in the field of AI, another Master of Science in Natural Language Processing, and a PhD in Cognitive and Brain Science. So no one could accuse you of not knowing your stuff, I think, right? As well as having then spent several years, as you did, at Spotify and then DeepMind, before you founded Glyphic. So there is obviously currently a lot of noise around the future of AI and the search for AGI specifically, but I'd love for you to give us a history of how things have really moved from the last even 3 or 4 years ago to today, because it feels like that pace of change has just been absolutely exponential, right?
Yeah, definitely. Really fast pace. I would say even a lot of internal, even researchers within the space didn't realize that it was going to move this fast. And I think there's, several different ingredients that actually contributed to this. One would be just scaling up models, I think. And that's for that and by scaling up models, I mean models that are getting increasingly in size in terms of the number of parameters they have, the kind of the knobs that we kind of adjust as we train AI models on some training data. So I think that would be one thing. Another thing would be data and using data in training and scaling the data as well. I think until recently, a lot of the data sets that we used in machine learning were relatively small. And now we've been really using as much data as we can. All this was also kind of precipitated by having access to a machine learning model that can actually support ingesting a lot of data and then also being scaled across many GPUs, and actually access to GPUs. Another thing that kind of influenced the current rise or the development in AI models. And I think this is all, looking back, this is all kind of makes sense. This was maybe the way we were supposed to go, but a lot of people didn't realize that this will be the way to go. Using relatively simple models, but that really scale with compute and data. And I think there was the human factor as well. People at OpenAI, people training early GPT models, kind of really believing that scale will take us a long way towards much, much better models. And I think all these things over the last few years, really, maybe 4 or 5, led us to where we are now.
And I mean, let's just talk about that for a second. Did anyone expect the speed at which these models have been able to scale? And I mean, there's also stacked machine learning. So you have models on top of models on top of models, or, to use the philosophical phrase, it's turtles all the way down. It's now models all the way down, right? So has that been a function of the GPU? Has that been a function of, Moore's law to an extent? Has that been a function of just better understanding of the algorithm? I mean, give me a feel for kind of how we made that step change from here's an algorithm. We're going to talk about this a little bit more detail, but how we made that step change from, argument's sake, becoming, AI being able to beat Go masters or chess masters, to essentially what we're seeing today, which is AI feeling like it can do very near human-like, certainly, language processing. And what drove that really? Like, what was it that really changed that allowed that to happen?
So I would say maybe kind of all those, things that I described were really there to make that happen. But I think also working within language made it much more accessible to the wider audience. Kind of when you look at, for example, AlphaGo, you would say, a lot of the things were already, a lot of the ingredients were already there. It was just, in a domain that maybe not that many people knew about or would understand. There's not that many Go players, within the wider population, but everyone needs to write an email, everyone wants to have a chatbot, etc. So I think kind of also moving away, let's say, from that domain into language that everyone can play with, that kind of made it a bit more accessible as well. But in terms of in terms of did we expect the space, the pace of change, I would say no. Kind of we knew we were going to get somewhere eventually. We wanted to get here, but we didn't know. Will it be 10 years, 3 years, and how it will actually look like?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because I think essentially what you described is it's almost like AI was a solution in search of a problem, and the problem ended up being, or the most obvious problem at scale is language, right? Yeah. Like, how do you converse with a machine, and how do you get a machine to converse back with you, right? I think for a lot of people, when you think about machine learning models and it's sort of data crunching and often sort of perceived as very numerical, right? Like, that is not necessary in everyone's domain, whereas everyone uses language, everyone talks, everyone speaks, everyone writes an email, right? And I think, some of the things, so, the first project you worked on at DeepMind, which is protein folding, like, again, even though that sounds really exciting to me for like the general population, it's like, okay, so what? Like, how is that going to help me? Like, and they may be able to get from A to B that, okay, this is how protein folding over time will help, improve medicine or whatever it might be. But it felt very remote. Whereas again, as you say, right, it's that initial kind of like, wow, I can actually just sit here and talk to it on my phone or my computer. I think that's really changed. Do you think that? Because one of the things that's been interesting to me is, I speak to a lot of founders within the sort of LLM space, building on generative AI, I should say. And, one in particular that sticks out to me, I was talking to him, he holds a degree in philosophy from Oxford or Cambridge, I can't remember now. But, he was saying to me, all the prompt engineers that he is hiring are actually philosophy grads or English grads or economics grads, like people with language skills rather than coding or mathematical skills. Is that a trend that you think may continue because of this ubiquitousness of the language model? Or is this like a temporary phase whereby, those prompt engineers essentially are training the AI about how it should better prompt itself?
No, I think it will actually continue, because what's nice about language is this kind of this universal interface to everything. We as humans, we communicate with language, but we also store knowledge with language. We can have an LLM kind of give out commands to a robot, do this, do that in language as well. And so the fact that it's this common interface makes it really widely applicable and also widely accessible to humans, because we communicate via language. And then, previously, if you wanted to maybe fine-tune a machine learning model, you actually had to be, a software engineer, run your code, etc. Whereas now with human language, you can actually affect a little bit the way the AI model behaves in your own application. And that makes it, I think, quite exciting and also much more accessible to everyone.
Yeah, like, I mean, just whilst you're saying that, I was just thinking, like, so essentially what you're saying is prompt engineers or even individuals like myself can affect the way a language model ultimately will output, right? So if I input something or ask it a question, it comes back with a response. I say, okay, that response is 80% valid, but actually here are bits that I would disagree with, and this is where that then actually goes back into training the model, right? Which essentially, if you're not calling an API from OpenAI and you're just using ChatGPT, it is being trained on everything that you're prompting it, right?
Yeah, so I guess that's one thing. And another thing is that just, being able to give that additional context to a model when it, does things for you. I think that's, really useful as well. And in a way, you could consider it as a little bit as kind of personalization of that model, or kind of small fine-tuning of the model for your specific use case. And I think that's gonna stay.
Yeah, which again, I mean, I think OpenAI just released autonomous agents or agents. I can't remember what they've specifically called it, but essentially to do exactly that, right? So that you could actually fine-tune the model very specifically to whatever domain that you want to fine-tune it to, and then essentially you could even launch that on their app store, which they've released and so on. And related to this all, I mean, I've had lots of conversations with quite a few people that contend that the intelligence in AI is greatly overstated, right? So from your perspective, where does the algorithm stop and the AI begin?
I think this is a very difficult question, and I think there's a lot of discussion around that. And I would say also it's always shifting a little bit, because when we have a model that's kind of performing better than we expected, after a while we get used to that, and we maybe shift the goalpost again a little bit. So I think it's going to be this kind of never-ending, improvements, iterative improvements, and AGI will always be somewhere, a bit ahead in the future, or at least that's how it will be over the next few years. But we're already, we're already kind of really, really far. And I think when you look at, people working with ChatGPT and similar models, they will tell you that it's doing intelligent things. And it's difficult to argue with that, because it's actually solving problems for them. It's it's actually solving problems. One of the common kind of complaint here is that it's maybe just remixing what it's seen. Yeah. But to be honest, what's a remix and what's a novel idea? I think that's another philosophical question there. Yeah. I can tell you a story kind of going back to my Spotify days. One thing that I was working on was kind of taking remixes and identifying the underlying tracks that contributed to that remix. And then internally we were kind of we were debating a lot, what's a remix and what's a novel track, and where do we draw the line, where is it just an inspiration and where it's a creative act, and it's just basically impossible to kind of decide where that is. I think the consequences within music are not as big as maybe the consequences around AI models and the implications there, but I think it's as a metaphor, it's a useful metaphor for that.
Well, I think you could even take a step further, right? Like, I mean, one of the great phrases, we stand on the shoulder of giants, right? So if I think about, like, I talk a lot about what makes a great CFO, because that's kind of the domain that I'm in, right? But when I think about what makes a great CFO, it is the sum total of the knowledge and experiences that they're going over time. Being a CFO is not about, for example, qualifying. Like, it's not about taking an exam and all of a sudden you are a CFO. Mm-hmm. Actually, it's, have you been through a funding round? Do you understand what a KPI looks like in this business versus that business? Have you understood how capital flows? And, are you able to intrinsically, almost subconsciously spot that, hold on, we're gonna face a problem in 6 months' time because of X, Y, Z, right? So, you could argue that human intelligence is the sum of our experiences. And, it is not only the sum of our experiences, but we created this amazing thing, language, which allowed us to read the philosophers of the Greco-Roman times or Far Eastern times, or Eastern philosophy from, 2,000-3,000 years ago, and continue to do that over the centuries since then, right? Like, at the end of the day, you could ask, for example, would Einstein have come up with this theory of relativity if Newton hadn't come up with the first principles, right, of motion and so on? So I guess that's the point, right? Are we comparing like almost, are we expecting more from the AI than we expect from ourselves, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's kind of, that discussion will continue, but I feel like, a lot of what we do is actually just remixing our previous experiences in some maybe potential novel ways, but even the novelty could be kind of argued how novel that is. And so a lot of intelligence is just remixing, and I think it's, as we get better remixing, a lot of the CFO. It's the intuitions are really kind of how do you draw on the previous experiences and then draw some inferences from that and then act in the world. And I think we can do a lot of that at scale with automated systems.
Yeah, and not only that, but actually, even as a CFO, I can't give you a definitive answer about anything. I will give you, here are the range of possibilities of X, Y, or Z happening if we do A, B, or C. And essentially, that's what AI is doing, right? It's giving you predictions based on whatever information it has to go on. And it might give you 2 or 3 predictions based on, different changes in any of those inputs, right? And actually that for me, I tried to build something kind of in this space, in the CFO tech space using, or with a plan to use sort of AI and generative AI in there. I stopped because I saw it's a very complex problem. I didn't have the capital behind me to be able to do it, et cetera, et cetera. But I actually do think that, much in the same way, and it's interesting, one of the things that we thought about was, okay, how do we do predictive revenue, for example, right? I'm sure a lot of what you do at Glyphic actually has crossover with what we thought we might be able to do, right? In that sense. That ability to predict, and I think it's that ability to predict that is super important to understand within AI, or not ability to predict, but its ability to come up with potential predictions, right? Because we know that if you give something to a computer, it is more likely to have the right answer, quote unquote, than a human being, right? In the sense that if you put the trolley problem, for example, right, like the computer will make a decision that is not driven by emotion, which is partly what the human experience is about. And therefore, we know that you will have fewer accidents on the road if you have autonomous cars. But the argument against it is, but you're taking, you're taking away that human element, which, is really important if you come across a trolley problem. But actually the reality is 9 times out of 10, right? Or 99 times out of 100, the computer is going to still come up with a solution that is going to be less harmful than a human being. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, it's difficult to kind of draw whether it's 99
whatever
cases,
the percentage
but
is.
Definitely. I think it can definitely help us actually maybe even review more options and look at the data from different angles, and then maybe help us make a more informed decision. And I think that's that's a very straightforward application of AI now, I would say.
Yeah, 100%. So it's less about, is this the decision? Here are the range of decisions.
Exactly.
And then you
consider this, consider that.
Exactly.
This could be a potential angle, etc.
Yeah. What are the implications if you do this? Yeah. No, look, 100%. I think I think, again, part of the problem has been over the last year, 2 years, is like the expectation is AI will give me the answer. Well, no, AI can give you an answer or a range of answers, but you still have to use some human intelligence, let's put it that way, to figure out whether that is the right answer for the situation that you are currently in, right? So let's talk about Glyphic for a moment, right? So can you talk me through what an autonomous agent actually is? Because there's a lot of talk about that, and I remember building or trying to build on some of the autonomous agents that were released. I think, gosh, feels like centuries ago. It was probably only 6 months ago, but baby AGI and all of these sort of things. But so what an autonomous agent is and how in general they're applied, and then more specifically how you are thinking about them for revenue teams at Glyphic. And we talked a little bit about this in the primer, but I'd love to get a bit of a deeper understanding.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think kind of there's a whole range, I think, at which we can operate. And I think we're going from, let's say, the augmentation more towards autonomous. We're not going to be at autonomous kind of stage anytime soon, but kind of where we are starting is actually for all that decision making that you need to make in, whether you're, let's say, a sales rep or whether you're a sales leader, kind of trying to figure out, should we hire more people? Should we invest in this new product line? Should we invest in this new geo? Do we need to improve our sales process? All that stuff. What we're trying to do initially is to actually get you all that, different points of view based on all the conversations and all the data that your company has access to. So kind of using those conversations and structuring them in a way so that you can actually use them to make those decisions. So, people, let's say customers are coming to us with all these different pain points, or they mention all these objections, or they want all these feature requests that maybe we need to first meet. Kind of making sense of all that information is that kind of where we want to start. Having this data and having kind of this complete and objective data is the starting point to actually make more, let's say, efficient decisions and kind of decisions within your company. And I think that's where we're working on now, so that you have all this objective information. Using then this information, you can actually look at how you can improve the process, how you can kind of iterate on the process, iterate on the product, so to actually improve the efficiency of your kind of revenue team in general. What's the marketing collateral that we should be maybe putting? Because let's say people are coming to us with these pain points and we're really not covering them in our marketing at all. There's just so many things that you can semi-automate, because you can actually, you can have all these insights being proactively pushed to, let's say, your marketing team or to your sales reps on the ground, so that they can then make decisions. Eventually, you could imagine that you could actually automate this a bit more, and then some of these strategic decisions could be made automatically based on all that data. But I think it's going to take a while before we build that trust, and also we build that capability.
So I mean, it raises for me, this is the big question, right, with all of this, which is the data. And what I mean by that is, having worked in multiple startups like pre-seed, seed, series A, B, C, like they have a lot of data. They have a lot of unstructured data, and all of those businesses have their data sitting in different places, with different structures, with different language use, not necessarily real time, right? And to your point, if you think about revenue teams, you've got to ingest data on the financials. You've got to look at data from the CRM. You've got to look at data from marketing. You've got to look at data from the product, feedback, customer service, et cetera, et cetera. Like, how easy is it, right? So if you have a platform, right, Glyphic, that says, right, we can help revenue teams, surely that means, though, that you have to keep building like multiple multiple API calls, or use a Snowflake or some sort of other data parser that can essentially get the data into Glyphic so that it is valuable. Like, and in fact, one of the conversations I've had with a VC, actually going back a year now, but one of the things she said to me was, the winners, and we were talking about in the CFO tech space again, she said the winners aren't the people that are going to output the information, it's the people that can figure out how to get the information into the AI in the first place.
Yeah, no, definitely agree. And I think it's not easy, and you kind of, you start small and kind of build iteratively and try to ingest more and more data. I think what's the recent advances, let's say, in large language models, what they've shown is that what you can achieve when you scale the data that you ingest and train on as much data as possible. And I think when you look at ChatGPT and similar models, they've been mostly trained on publicly available data. That's kind of, what we see in terms of data out there on the internet. Yeah. There's just so much data within enterprises that are not used by any kind of AI models. Let's call it kind of the black universe of data, or something like that, black space. And I think that is where a lot of the advances, I would say, for kind of enterprise specific applications will happen. Definitely kind of integrations are difficult to build, but I think we're getting there. Many of these systems have APIs that you can ingest, then format in a way that you can actually ingest it and train models on it. So I think we're going to move slowly, but surely in that direction.
So a side question that kind of arises from that point, right, which is, let's say you have 5 companies that you're working with, and I'm not necessarily talking about Glyphic specifically, and this is potentially more a question, like it's a wider question around data privacy and data anonymity, right? If let's use Glyphic as a use case, right? You're working with 5 businesses, you're ingesting data from each of those 5 businesses. Does that data and the way you train your model, or when you're training your model on company A's data, will that training impact company B's output?
Yeah.
Do you understand what I mean?
Definitely. And no, so this is definitely what also companies don't want, because they're very kind of, for good reasons, they wouldn't want their data to be used, let's say, to improve operations of another company. So I think but
surely that would be actually the utopia, right? Which is like everyone's data training everyone.
Yeah, definitely utopia. But I think we can get very far by actually training models on public available data, and then fine-tuning them for specific use cases on the local data. Where you can kind of take advantage of everything that's there publicly available, which very often is, to be honest, some kind of summary of private data that companies have. but then you could fine tune it for the use case for that specific company.
It's interesting. So I was talking to an accountant actually the other day, and he was talking about they ran a training day for 600 people in their UK or London office or whatever it was, and he used I think he used Bard to essentially create some use cases or some scenarios, right? And those scenarios are going to be put to the team, and they were going to have to come up with responses. And Bard came up with both the scenarios and the responses were correct. And one of the conversations I was having with him, or he was having with me, I should say, is that what he finds incredible is obviously a large part of how people have thought about marketing and SEO is putting out data or putting out information, let's put it that way, into the public domain, right? Like that's how you attract users. So if I am a tax accountant, I'm talking about VAT and income tax and, you know, changes in regulations and the autumn statement, right? Et cetera, et cetera. And that was a way of driving traffic towards you. Now, because the LLM has essentially been trained on all your publicly available data, you no longer have a differentiator, right? Like, so I don't know that I even have a question here, but it feels to me that that's a really interesting or could lead to a really interesting shift, because if you are putting data out publicly that an LLM can essentially train itself on and give responses back to a user that are essentially 90% of the way there in terms of what they need, does that actually kill your ability as a business to you know, to differentiate? And you know, should we be thinking about stopping putting our data out publicly, I guess, is a question, right?
Yeah, no, a good question. I would say it's going to basically push companies towards putting out more high quality data and maybe more hyper specific for the use cases that might actually, you know, that they're hearing from their customers, and that are just, kind of a bit more specific. Whereas a lot of the content that companies been pushing out is kind of very generic, so that you capture as, you know, as wide an audience as possible. And I think we'll have to maybe push more specific, maybe high volume of more specific viewpoints.
But I guess the flip side of that actually is, you know, if you, again, thinking about Glyphic, right? If you are able to train internally or train an LLM with your internal data that gives you better insights into your own revenue operations, you can also you can also target way better, right?
Exactly.
So again, to your point, like you don't need to be as generic, because you can say, well, actually, I don't care about, you know, this audience of 300 businesses or 3,000 businesses that actually are never going to come to me, but those 5, like, I can make a lot of money out of. So if I get hyper targeted, then, you know, that's going to work out better for me.
Exactly. Yeah. I know I'm going to close these, you know, 5 use cases. I'm not going to close these other 10 use cases. Yeah. And so I'm just focusing on those 5. Yeah.
Yeah. 100%. And finally, I want to talk about, you know, we sort of touched on this, but I want to talk about this in a bit more detail. So in July this year, Mustafa, Suleyman, who is one of the co-founders of DeepMind, of course, wrote in the MIT Technology Review that the Turing test has potentially already been passed. And we've talked about, you know, where does the algorithm stop and intelligence start, I guess. But, you know, he argues that it's potentially already been passed and proposed an updated test for the current generation of AI, and his test is much more around the sort of commercial output that the AI could potentially give us. So can you talk us through the principles that he's proposing and how close you think we are getting to AGI? And again, I know we slightly touched on this, but I'd love to get your perspective.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that's related to what we discussed a little bit in the primer as well, around evaluations of models and also kind of models acting in the real world. So kind of when we look back to the original Turing test that was used as kind of the benchmark of AI for the last many decades, it was introduced mid last century. And kind of briefly, you know, I'm sitting in a room and exchanging messages with something or someone. And through that conversation, I need to understand whether that something or someone is a person or a computer. And then at a point where I'm not able to distinguish that, then that's a Turing test of intelligence. And that's something that machine is actually AI intelligence.
And just, sorry to interrupt, but I guess, you know, one of the counter arguments to the Turing test is the Chinese room, or the Chinese, I can't remember what it's exactly called, but the premise being you could have someone sitting in a room who doesn't speak a word of Chinese, and someone outside the room feeding Chinese character script into the room, and then you could have a book with lookup tables of Chinese characters. If you see this, say this. If you see this, do that. And they could essentially then write out a response in Chinese script without understanding it at all and pushing that through the door, right? And that would essentially pass a Turing test, but it wouldn't necessarily be a sign of intelligence, right?
I guess it depends kind of how you define intelligence for yourself and kind of how you want to use it. But I mean, as long as it's doing useful things for you, it's just difficult to argue that it's not doing something intelligent. I think that kind of going back to what we discussed earlier, I think it's difficult to where to draw the line there, I think.
Yeah. And so that was the old Turing test. So what is Mustafa kind of arguing?
So, I mean, there might be now discussions around whether we've passed this or not, but you might side with whichever side you want, but we definitely, ChatGPT is producing text that's, very, very, very to the point and also very human-like. And then when you actually test for some kind of simple prompts or simple questions, actually people might prefer the ChatGPT generated text because it's, more to the point, more concise, very often even more correct than a human generated text on the same topic. And so maybe at that point we might have passed it. But I think what's the modern Turing test, what it's proposing is actually putting a model into the world and let it act. So far, the original Turing test was more around conversation and kind of from that trying to figure out whether we have intelligence or not. Here we're actually taking a model and we're asking it, here's $100K. Go act in the world in whichever way you want and turn this into $1 million. And one example, for example, there would be, let's do it in web retail. I don't know, you can set up an e-commerce store, figure out which product you want to do based on some kind of research. You could, for example, ingest all discussions on Reddit to figure out what's the best thing to produce. It could be, for example, I want to print t-shirts with some DALL-E generated images, something like that. No one has thought about it. Let me set up a shop front for that. Then kind of once you have this idea, and we're asking the model to do this actually, once it has this idea, it needs to figure out other things. Kind of how do you build that store? Which APIs do you maybe connect to actually build that store and have it publicly available on the internet? How do you do logistics?
How do you source the product?
Exactly, all that stuff.
What's the pricing?
And that's basically, this is a test for a model. A lot of this can be done from a computer, and most actually entrepreneurs would do it, from their office somewhere sitting and then emailing, calling, setting up shops, etc.
I mean, there's 1,000 Instagram influencers here's how you can make 100,000 in your spare time, and it's all around essentially that sort of stuff, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And now with these models, they can just sit there and actually issue these commands. Maybe sometimes a human will have to be in the loop to do something, maybe to confirm that this is done by a human, because
they need
you need to receive a text message, etc. But a lot of this can be done by a model. Even a lot of that strategic thinking around, what kind of product do I want to sell? How do I deal with logistics and all that stuff? And I think that's an interesting test to actually, take a model and then let it do actions in the real world. And then maybe, going back to the Chinese room discussions that we had there, here you have a model that actually issuing actions in the real world, getting some feedback from the real world, and then
changing it
on that.
Yeah. And what's actually interesting again there is that, again, in the early days of ChatGPT, you had, and I remember this on Twitter, people running those experiments, but with human intervention, in the sense that, it would say to the AI, you are going, we're going to start with some capital of $1,000, want to turn that into $10,000, whatever it is. Come up with a process that allows me to do that, right? And think about what the best way of doing that is in 30 days or whatever the time period is. And so whilst, what you're saying is letting the AI go out and do that autonomously, i.e. act in the world, the only difference there was the human being would be the actor, right? So so essentially the human being was saying, I will follow whatever it is you tell me to do, and I will do that. Now, I can't remember whether many of those outcomes were good, bad, or ugly, but I think there was a lot of, it definitely felt like there was a lot of potential there. And actually, the only difference then is taking the human being out of the loop there.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think it's going to be quite interesting to observe. I think when you look at maybe the web retail example, might be even a bit too difficult, because you need to do, you have physical product, you need to deal with things there. Going back, let's say, to the Glyphic example that we discussed before, when you have a B2B SaaS product, most of the interactions are, let's say, that you have maybe with your customers are on Zoom calls and emails. The product actually lives in the cloud. There's very little physical that's involved, and it might be actually easier to do to do a model like this that's kind of optimizing, let's say, both the product and the revenue process of a company, just using all this data that it has access to.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know, my mind is constantly blown away, right? I think about kind of where we're going. I think about it in terms of my children. I have a 23 and a 16-year-old, and I constantly tell them the world in 10 years' time is not going to look like the world today, and the jobs in 10 years' time are not going to look like the jobs of today. So you got to figure out how to best place yourself in a world where essentially a lot of that augmentation is going to come via AI. Just as a kind of closer, how would you think about that? Like, I mean, are you one of these sort of AI absolutists that, everyone's going to be, no one's going to have a job outside of very, very physical kind of activities? Or do you think that, actually there is a world where essentially we have better output and productivity because of the AI, and it's not actually replacing?
Yeah, as an optimist, I'm hoping for this latter situation. So it's going to make us more efficient and effective, but we're going to still have a role to play. But I think what's important there is, we definitely need to think about the impact of AI models. What type of, subpopulations is it empowering? We need to monitor that. And I think another thing, to take into account there is we need to deploy these models actually now iteratively, so that people get used to it, so that they're not surprised. If we were now not deploying these models and not thinking about the safety aspects or kind of how it affects the society, then we might get to a point, let's say 5 years out, where we don't actually know how to deal with it. Whereas if we have safe deployments, kind of iterative deployments of these models now, slowly we get used to kind of working with them and using them.
And to that point, I mean, what's your view on kind of regulation, right? So in the UK, Europe, we look like we're going down quite a heavy regulatory kind of route, whereas in the US, as often is the case, it's sort of slightly more liberal towards it. I mean, like, do you think that regulation is actually going to be a help or a hindrance in kind of getting to those goals?
So I think it's a question of kind of the amount of regulations. I was kind of thinking back, let's say, even 5-10 years, a lot of people kind of were maybe looking at the safety aspects of AI, not taking them very seriously, just because you couldn't really imagine how fast it can get to that space. But at the same time, let's say the example of ChatGPT, the fact that it was published and that it's out in the public, kind of, I think, spurred a lot of the safety discussions, the UK Safety Summit,
because it happened so quickly.
Because it happened, and then people actually started thinking about it. If we regulated it so much that it was impossible to, let's say, put ChatGPT out there for people to play with, maybe a lot of the safety discussions that we're having now wouldn't even happen, because they would have been precluded by the regulation. So I'm hoping the regulations will allow for kind of gradual deployment of ever more powerful models, and then through that we kind of learn how to work with them and how to regulate them, and maybe how to mitigate some of the biases and side effects that they might have.
I mean, whatever else anyone says, I think it's very exciting times ahead. Adam, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. It's been absolutely incredible speaking to you and learning from you. For our listeners, where can they find you? Are you online? Where's the best place for them to look for you? On LinkedIn, Twitter? Where can they find you?
So I'm on LinkedIn, on Twitter. You can find me there, or glyphic.ai for the company.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you.
Thanks a lot for inviting me. I really enjoyed it as well.
Amazing.